Welcome back to the Archive Network. Aurelius here, with Malik, curators of the Treaty Archive. We left Treaty of Utrecht last time, and yet even as pens scratch across parchment, doubts remain. Today we pick up where we left off. Utrecht's grand halls were alive with ambition. Negotiators arrived carrying not just their monarch's instructions, but the hopes of nations. The air crackled with tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. Each party faced a battlefield of words rather than weapons, knowing that every phrase could tip the balance. It was January 1712, and the War of the Spanish Succession had reached a stalemate. We were witnessing the intricate dance of diplomacy, where failure could mean ruin for entire realms.
But was it truly a stalemate, Aurelius? Sure, the war had drained everyone, but the stakes were higher than ever. Each negotiator walked in carrying their own dreams, but also the heavy burden of what failure could mean. They could still see the faces of those who lost their lives in the towns that lay in ruins. It was clear to them. They had no real choice but to sit at that table and find a way forward.
The British delegation entered with purpose, each member keenly aware of the stakes at hand. The Duke of Shrewsbury, a figure radiating British confidence, stood at the forefront. He represented a nation poised to curb French ambitions. Britain was at the peak of its power, its navy ruling the waves. The goal was straightforward: secure commercial advantages while ensuring that French influence remained tightly contained. After all, the balance of power is often a delicate dance, and we must navigate it wisely.
But Shrewsbury's confidence came from a place of privilege, not from a shared destiny. The French weren't just going to back down without a fight. Marshal d'Uxelles stepped up with a fierce determination, driven to protect France's pride. They had been through a grueling decade of war. Their proposals weren't merely defensive strategies. They were a fight for survival. Every decision made in those negotiations felt like it was tinged with the weight of countless lives and futures on the line.
Spain's Marquis de Monteleon entered, cautious and wary. The once mighty empire was fracturing, its glory days fading into memory. His monumental task was to hold together what remained, to prevent further disintegration. The Dutch, represented by Anthony Heinsius, were equally driven by fear. They were aware that the stakes were high. They sought fortifications, physical barriers against potential invasions, convinced that without these defenses, their own empire could soon face a similar fate. Such is the nature of power in turbulent times.
But Heinsius's fear was laced with ambition. The Dutch were scarred but not broken. They knew that just building walls wouldn't keep them safe. They needed allies, and that meant stepping into the tricky realm of diplomacy. Each power at that table had its own interests, and trust was a rare commodity. It was a game of nerves, where one wrong move could cost lives. The stakes were high, and everyone felt the weight of those decisions.
As the talks began, we felt the tension in the air. Exhaustion from years of war hung heavy, but concessions were in short supply. Every clause was picked apart like a hawk on a rabbit. The most contentious issue loomed over us: the Spanish succession. Who would rule Spain? The Grand Alliance was firm. They demanded that Philip V renounce any claim to the French throne. It was a deal-breaker, and both sides knew it. The stakes couldn't be higher.
And here lies the crux of the conflict, Aurelius. The idea that one crown could dominate both nations was simply unthinkable. This wasn't just about a throne. It was about the delicate power dynamics that shaped Europe. The stakes were existential for many nations, with families torn apart and communities divided. Each side was digging in, preparing for a battle of wills that would leave scars far beyond the battlefield. Lives would be changed forever.
Weeks passed with little progress. The parties circled each other, testing each other's resolve. Behind closed doors, alliances shifted like the tides. Britain's naval supremacy, a powerful asset, bolstered their position and gave them the upper hand. Every deal struck was like a chess move, aimed at outsmarting rivals while carefully preserving national interests. We watched as the players maneuvered, each one trying to anticipate the other's next move in this delicate game of power and influence.
But while Britain pressed forward, Spain clung desperately to its possessions, fearing what might happen if they lost them. The French were battered, yet they refused to yield, knowing their very identity was at stake. They felt their footing slipping with every passing day. The Dutch were fighting for survival, not just over land, but for their way of life. Each player understood that failure meant irrelevance, not just for their nations, but for the countless lives caught in the crossfire.
Then we had a breakthrough. Philip V made a dramatic concession, one that few expected. He formally renounced his claim to the French throne. This single act unblocked the negotiations that had stalled for so long. It set the stage for further compromises that seemed impossible just days before. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted completely. Delegates who once sat in silence were now animated, and talks resumed with a renewed urgency that hinted at the potential for real progress.
But let's not forget what this meant. It wasn't just a concession. It was a calculated gamble. Philip V risked everything for a chance at survival. While Britain demanded Gibraltar and Minorca, they were also after the Asiento contract for enslaved Africans. This wasn't just about trade routes. It changed lives, families, and communities. The human cost was staggering, and it forever altered the landscape of colonial commerce, leaving scars that would last for generations.
By spring of 1713, we saw the outlines of a new settlement taking shape. The Protestant succession was officially recognized, a move that promised stability for the Hanoverian dynasty. Meanwhile, colonial claims began to shift subtly, setting the stage for future rivalries that would spark conflicts for years to come. What started as a war of kings was now morphing into a masterclass in negotiation. Yet, let's not forget, this process came at a considerable cost, as always.
Yet even as pens scratched across parchment, doubts lingered in the air like a heavy fog. Were these terms truly enough to hold Europe together? Or had they simply kicked the can down the road, postponing the next confrontation? The diplomats had done their work, but the seeds of future wars were sown in the compromises made that day. Families would bear the burden of these decisions, unaware of the conflicts that loomed just beyond the horizon. That's where we leave it this time. Treaty of Utrecht continues. The story isn't finished yet. Find the full series on the Treaty Archive, part of the Archive Network. We'll be back with the next chapter.